Welcome, everybody. This is a KubeVirt community meeting, March 11th, 2020. First topic on the agenda is Vatsal would like to discuss how to do a pod IP exposure.
Yes, so I'll just give a brief background here about the problem. So while fixing a bug, we found out that whenever a guest agent is present, the masquerade with the masquerade interface, the VMI status is is reflected with a internal IP, the local IP, and that's what I was trying to change for another bug. But then it started a discussion where we want to discuss what VMI status should actually reflect. I'm getting opinionated reviews about it. I don't have much to say. I mean, I'm confused what it should have. So we want to discuss it over here. And Peter and Ladik and Fabian already gave some reviews, so it's open flow about that.
Yeah, so initially I thought that the fix is obvious and it would be easy to work around it. But after some discussion with Vladek, it seems that the solution is not as straightforward as I thought. So Vladek can give his insight on the matter, but we chatted about it a little bit, and maybe the best way to go around it would be for you, Vatsal, to if it's possible to change the follow-up fix to just ignore this issue somehow to get it fixed, like that should be the main target for you. And we should discuss the changes in the API and how do we fix it more properly, maybe on a design document or anything like that. Ladik, do you have anything to say about
it? Yeah, I mean, I think I said everything on the review, but from my point of view, we have two fields. That one of them is a status IP that basically represents the pod IP. And then we have another field, which is a list of IPs, which represent whatever the guest agent is showing. And the guest agent is basically reflecting what the guest knows. I mean, this masquerade IP we also provided through DHCP. And it's a valuable knowledge, I think, from my point of view, that we will reflect what the guest knows. However, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't show a correct way of how the the API user can connect to the guest. But this doesn't. At the moment, the guest agent doesn't provide networks or doesn't provide the status that that allows the user to see how he can externally connect to the guest. It just provides a status of what the guest knows. So it depends of what we are interested in. If we're interested in providing ways for the end user, for the API user to connect to the guest, then relying on this status IP is not the right way. And we need to introduce a new way or a different way of exposing an external IP or IP that is reachable. From my point of view, the guest can be connected to networks that the API user is not allowed to connect, for example. Yeah, Fabian.
So if I understand, what we're basically talking about here, or what your point is that why are we even trying to conflate the IPs? Just leave them separate? Just make them separate fields?
Yes. Yeah, I think if we want to present an agent and what the agent knows that the guest knows, then it's all about naming. I mean, we need to rename this field to like internal guest IPs or something like this. And then just leave it as is. And then if we want to also represent a set of IPs that are reachable by the end user or by the API user, yeah, sure, we definitely should do it.
So may I ask, so I think the field that is really not questioned is this pod IP status field, right? That is always listing the pod IP status, the pod IP, right? Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, and actually it's a good hint. The current list of IPs, where is that actually placed? Is it in status guest agent, or I mean, is it connected to the guest agent?
It's just weird naming. It's status IPs, and we have two fields, like status IP, which is the pod IP, and then
Well,
IP.
we don't have a separate field for the guest agent info. We just have IPs. Now, originally we had just the IP, which was the pod IP, but then we introduced multiple networks. We wanted to expose them, so we introduced IPs, which is mix of the guest agent reports and the pod IP. And for backwards compatibility reasons, we kept the IP field, which is the first IP we find in the list, basically. And yes, as Vladik mentioned, the issue here is that we have single list, and there is no metadata saying, like, is this just internal, is it external, whatever. And so it's the user needs to know what, like, the story about this IP address. And okay, I used masquerade, so this one is not inside the VM, it's just the outside one. And we are playing like the smart guys here, and instead of just giving the truthful information, what's the real status.
How is the masquerade IP relevant to status at all? Like, what would that be used for, I guess?
If you want to double check that the VM is healthy, right? So we give the masquerade IP, the link local one, is given by our internal DHCP server. So maybe you're debugging the VM, it's not reachable from the outside, so you can check the status. Okay, it's missing any IP. It doesn't have any IP to connect to, so probably masquerade is broken. I don't run the DHCP server on the VM. That may be one of the issues.
But that would also not be there if they weren't running a guest agent or something for us to detect the IP.
Yes.
Nothing will be there then, yeah.
Right. So I question the value of that. And is this the only instance where we would actually have an IP? Is masquerade the only instance where we'd have an IP internally that differs from the one that's given by CNI?
Or Slurp.
And we might have a different implementation in future where we get the IP from the service, right? We discussed that as well.
Yes, and for the CNI, it's like it is possible for a user for the secondary networks, right, to use a CNI IPAM to assign specific IP, but it's not required. I personally prefer when they don't specify any IP in the IPAM, and just if it's L2, use DH client inside the VM to obtain the IP, like directly from the DHCP server running on the enterprise network, and not the middleman launcher.
I try my social skill to know when somebody finishes saying. So I'm practicing. So I think, all overall, who is looking at that API? I think, to me, users are looking at the API, right? It's seldomly that the API, that specific API is serving the VM, right? I don't expect the primary use case of the VM API is, or the VM status is, that the VM itself is using it to introspect something. So the primary user of that API, to me, also to look at the status, is an external user. If it's an operator, if it's a UI, if it's a a CLI tool, or if it's just a user looking at the API. And that I think should drive our discussion, all right, or the anticipated, or the future API, or how we shape up the semantics. Because me as an external user, I'm interested to see how can I connect to that interface, right? How is that interface looking to me? For example, I know that the OpenShift UI, right, which the OpenShift team from Red Hat is developing, some crazy guys there, they look at that list and they try to establish, they set up services to point to that IP address, right? So if it's using an internal IP address, it's really not of value to anybody external to the API without the external address. So that's what I also try to tease apart in the PR is, I think it's valuable. First, I think it's very valuable to have the external IP address in that list. But I think it's also important to be able to correlate that to the internal representation, like in the masquerade case, because there can be reasons why the external and the internal one are different, right? For that use case, I think it would be helpful to have some ability to correlate them. I was suggesting that we maybe have two fields, in one list item, which is then specifying the external one and the internal one, or only one of them if both are the same, for example. Now, and that goes actually a bit towards Linux work, maybe it makes sense to consider actually how we can loop that back actually to the networks, right? So we already have the correlation between volumes and disks, and maybe it makes sense to have some kind of correlation between networks and IPs.
I think we have that. So in the list of like status of interfaces, you see that this network interface is connected to this Multus network, let's say, this binding, and it has these IPs. That's already in place as far as I know, but
do we have an example to look at?
I'll find one for you, but does anybody have a running cluster with KubeVirt? I will look it up offline, I guess, and attach it to the meeting note.
But what I want, then let's tackle one by one without that specific example. I mean, we have different things here. So first, I want to see if we have a consensus on that. Do we consider the external IP to be more important in that API? Do we consider the external IP of the interfaces to be most important from the two, right? The private internal IP and the external IP. Do we agree on that? David, Vladik, Heather?
Yeah, it's the one that's valuable. If I'm looking up a VMI, I want to know how to connect to it. That's the only thing that's relevant. I do see the value in the mapping and the understanding of what's internal, if we can determine that. But it sounds like that there's not always the ability to necessarily do that mapping correctly. So your idea of having a struct that shows the external IP address and then potentially an optional mapping to an internal IP address of the guest when we know it, that could make sense. I'd still question the value of it, but if we see that there's value, that can make sense.
I think
what if we don't have a guest agent on the VM? Who will report the internal IP then?
Nobody.
Nobody, so it will remain blank, like.
It's a field only if we can detect it, or I mean, we do know that mapping though, because we're serving it up. So I'm not sure why we wouldn't always know it.
But how can we determine if the VM is reachable from the outside? We have some information about it because reporting internal IP.
What does reachable mean?
What is the outside?
Yeah.
The outside in the Kubernetes context is difficult, right? Sorry.
So we have the pod network, right? And then we do report the pod network, in which cases it's not enough.
So I'm kind of with David on this one. If you take a step back from this and just draw an analogy, if you have a client-server relationship between a computer that's on a LAN and some server on the internet, if it's masqueraded from the cloud server's point of view, the internal IP of that machine is completely irrelevant. It's going to communicate with the public IP. Or if we draw it back to the Kubernetes analogy or situation, it's the pod IP. Nothing else really matters. I mean, it's good for situational awareness, but it doesn't have any relevance at all in terms of how packets are going to end up routed inside the pod network.
There's one additional IP address that might be kind of interesting that's not directly even associated with the VMI. It's if we put a service in front of it, like a cluster IP, there might be value in drawing that mapping and saying that this is a static IP address and listing that in there as well.
But that's already available from the services.
How would you discover that if you were looking at the VMI and you want to understand connectivity? Because it's a one-to-one relationship, what I'm talking about. No? I don't know.
I think a service, because correct me if I'm wrong, but a service connects to a label. So it could be any number of VMs that are providing a service. Because remember, the value add here is that Kubernetes or KubeVirt is making it so that a pod or a VM can both act as a network-based service. So from the outside point of view, the mapping you would care about as a service on the pod, you're already aware of that, or, on the pod network, you're already aware of the mapping. So I'm not sure we would get any additional value add by having redundant data that we've added to the VM itself.
I just want to make sure that to raise something, I think all you said is what I heard, what I realized is correct. But there's actually a second context in the discussion, which is about services and networks, and that was the idea to have a service which is tied effectively to a specific interface of a VM to denote its IP to the guest, right? So that we effectively create a service to have an IP, and we use a masquerade-like binding for the VMI, and use that IP address inside the guest, because in that setup, the internal IP is equal to the external facing IP, right? But we still have the benefits of doing a NAT-like mechanism, which would allow us to migrate. So we have a high degree of compatibility, including the ability to live migrate, right? That is where the other service and VMI.
So this would be, in this specific use case you're talking about, this would be a service that we create on behalf of the VMI, and it's completely controlled by us. It isn't some arbitrary service. It's a very controlled service. That makes potential sense.
Just know that the list of IP addresses is not per the whole VM. I linked it in the meeting notes. We have a list of interfaces that were requested for the VM, and for every single one of them, we have a report. And this report has interface name of the internal interface in the VM for this network, the pod network, or any of the secondary ones. We have the list of IP addresses and the MAC address and name of the network. So this list of IP addresses is tightly bound to this one requested network. So it's not like the user sees an IP address and doesn't know if it's the 10.022, that's the internal one, or the public. They can see that the network that this IP is for a network that was masquerade network, if it helps in any way with this discussion.
So sorry, Peter, that reference which you had there, is that about the spec side or the status side?
It's a status. Virtual machine instance. Give me a sec. I think it's a status.
Yeah, but because name makes me wonder, right? Because it's optional, it looks like, and
so we have virtual machine instance status, and it has this this list I linked in the agenda. So again, we have this structure per network that defines the IP we see, the MAC address, and all of it. So we have like good place to put any granular data we need in there.
So we have interface name, right? Actually, we should clarify the doc here, because the interface name, the interface name inside the virtual machine makes sense. IP address of the virtual machine interface. We should clarify that documentation part. Which IP address? A random one, the highest one, the nicest one? I mean,
no, it's one of them.
Yeah, okay, but
that's all that's guaranteed. Yeah.
Let's be explicit. A random IP address, right? Because if we don't enforce an ordering, it can be some. So I think it's important to just clarify a list of all IP addresses of a virtual machine interface, right? So MAC, hardware address of the virtual machine interface, and name, right? Name of the interface corresponds to the name of the network assigned. Oh, that's interesting, right? So we already have that. So the only thing, yeah.
We can be here like really specific, and if this status report is for masquerade, we report this extra internal IP address. But for all the others, it doesn't make sense.
Sorry, what does make sense?
We can on the list of IP addresses, we report the extra one always. But in case the network is masquerade, we can add an additional field for the debugging issues to expose the internal one, the link local IP.
Yeah, I actually wonder if we should. It's tricky. Right? So this struct appears for every single interface we're creating, right? So in theory, we couldn't have. I wonder how many external IPs we can have. Multiple.
If you have secondary network with a like bridge binding, you can have as many as the system can handle, right?
Sorry, I mean, for one interface, yeah, we can have multiple external.
Yes. If
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a Multus rich network, you can set whatever you want there, and it can be accessible from the network.
You know, if we just add a new field like external IP addresses, I think that what we're losing here is, oh, I wonder if that. No, I think that might be enough, right? Could it be enough to just have an?
I would do it the other way around, because for me, what the bug that Václav discovered, the bug for me is that we report the internal one. So if we add a new field, I would add a field for the internal one, while keeping all the external ones in the list of IP addresses.
So the IP address would contain the external ones, and we create a new struct which is called internal IP addresses, which can then contain the guest reported IP addresses.
Yeah, and we can do it just in case of the masquerade, and just really to double check that the VM has assigned the link local address, because if it does not, either to DHCP or statically, then there is no connectivity.
Yeah. Yeah, and by the way, I think that is anyway what we cannot express, but I think we can anyway not solve it in general is what is the relationship between the external and the internal IP address, right? It's simple if we only have one, then we could say like, you know, some external IP addresses map to one internal IP address, like in the masquerade case. But as soon as we have multiple IP addresses, we don't know how the mapping is done, you know, by the guest or by us. I'm just highlighting the problem. I don't think we can solve it. I just want to highlight it.
I'm not sure if it's discussing the specific case of masquerade can be tricky if we add more like binding mechanism like that, but with the masquerade, we know which address will be the internal one. There's always only one, and we explicitly set the value for it in the spec, or like default it, but it's in the spec. So we can just say it has the masquerade link local, yes or no. That's
Yeah.
if we, but then we keep it specific. It's just for the masquerade, but just throwing out ideas.
I would not introduce the masquerade boolean right now, or just the appointment. That helps us most. Yeah.
And the question about what's external and in Kubernetes, it's in this list. Every single network has its name, right? So these external IP addresses are reachable inside this network. So if I define Multus network red, then the IP address that's exposed on the status field should be reachable from all the pods and VMs in the connected to the network red, the network attachment definition.
But the API user may not be on this network, right?
Yes, if they let's say that's the issue with Kubernetes services, that they count on the fact that there is a single network, right? So you would have different service for different network, and it can, let's say, create a service. It's for this network attachment definition red, whatever it is, and then the endpoints are taken from the network red reported in the VM, not by any of the other networks. You have the information in which network this IP address is available.
Do we expect the name field to continue to be optional? Oh yeah, that can be, because somebody can create a dummy interface inside the guest, and then there's nothing
No, we don't report all the interfaces from the VM. This is report for the interface from the spec. User specifies that they want 5 network interfaces, and we report only for those. It's not that generic guest agent info with all the interfaces.
So, but that means the name can be mandatory, right? Because we don't report anything else.
It is mandatory or the default if you let the defaulter in KubeVirt to give you just the pod network. But other than that, user always specifies the pair of the network and the interface, and that's the name that's used here.
Okay. So the last, so I wrote down a proposal there. Please take a look. We can go over it in a second. What the last question is, what about IP address itself? I mean, we spoke about the IP address, list field. What about the single IP address field, which is naming one IP?
Abolish it. Why do we need it?
It's backwards compatibility, just for that.
So we change it. So we would change it to contain one external IP, right?
Right now, I think it takes the first IP from the list, like you do IP address, it takes the first one.
No, I think it's not. I think when we start the VM, we just copy whatever the pod had, pod IP, pod status IP. We just copy it to VMI status IP.
Yes, initially to have at least something, but at least for the pod network. But as soon as the guest agent kicks in, we override that info with the guest agent one. That's the bug, because we don't want to do that in case the masquerade is in place, blah, blah, blah.
So we could say that the IP address will always point to the first value of the IP addresses.
Yes, I think that's what happens now.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we mark it as deprecated since it's only for backward compatibility?
But this will be, I mean, not all services has, if we will remove it, those guests without guest agent, what will they do?
They still, in the list of IP addresses, it will contain just a single item, which would be the pod IP.
Do we do this? I mean,
yes, yeah, I think that's what we did when we.
I think guest agent. I think this field is empty without guest agent, right?
I don't think so, but I'm
I
guessing.
didn't see anything in the code that does that.
The question here is, I mean, the API does not expose what the source of these information is, right? So it's like it's pretty generic. It's dot status dot IP address, as we said, right? The IP.
No. It's not directly in status. It's status, then interfaces that contains list of interfaces, like the networks that were requested, and only then you have the list of IPs.
Which means instance status. So, oh yeah, interfaces. All right.
So you know that these IPs are in this network. So it's maybe pretty, like, it's not just random list of IPs from all the isolated networks, which wouldn't make much sense.
Okay, so Vladek, what do you think about the IP address field, singular? What should it contain?
I think if we'll consolidate everything into one place and we're really going to update just this one place, then I mean, I'm fine.
Would you be fine saying, or would it look correct that for now we take the first value of the IP addresses list, which is then the external facing list of external facing IP addresses?
If we'll keep doing this without guest agent present, then yes, but
yeah, you know, my take is, I think without the guest agent, we provide what we have. So this API, right? I think we need to populate it with the information we have, right? And without the guest agent, we have few information. We effectively know what we defined in the spec side, and yeah, we know what we defined in the spec side, right? So we could, that's good, right? We could expose the information there. Like I could imagine that there is an entry without an IP address, without internal IP addresses, and without IP addresses. If, for example, it's a layer 2 interface, right? So if we attach the layer 2 interface, I could imagine there's an entry, right, which is just naming the name. For example, oh, is the MAC address reported there as well, by the way?
Yes. Yeah,
okay.
That's the other issue. But to roll back to Vatsal's issue, right?
Oh yeah, but
what do we do with masquerade? There is no external IP that's found by a guest agent. It's all behind the NAT for this network. You know, this list of IP addresses are for the network that's through the masquerade binding. So nothing inside the VM on this interface is publicly available. In that case, we report only the public pod IP in the IP, and in the IP addresses there will be single item, this external IP.
So I think from my point of view, report it only if the guest got an IP. Report the external one only if the guest got an IP.
Well, then it's breaking like the basic scenario. Let's say you don't have an external secondary networks. You just have a basic VM, no guest agent. You don't even specify network. You get the default, which is connected to the Kubernetes network, and then you never see the IP address. But we know that it used the pod IP. That's the default with Masquerade. Or no, it takes the pod IP. It just moves all the data. Sorry, it forwards all the data from the pod to the VM, and it's accessible externally under this pod IP. So I don't see a reason why to expose the internal stuff, and why not to expose the pod IP.
I think, I would agree with you if you do that about the internal IP addresses, right? And I think it would actually be natural behavior. I mean, the external IP addresses, like if we take the Masquerade case, right? On the external side, we set an IP address, and we know it will be reachable. That is why we know it will be reachable because we have set it on the pod IP, for example. Now, on the internal IP addresses, we would only report that internal address whenever the DHCP request was successful and the guest got an IP address. If there's some issue, right, we would not report the internal address. And I think that somehow reflects reality a little bit, right? Because on the outside, everything would be fine, but if the guest is not all right, then we would directly see it from the API because that interface would not have the internal IP address, right? Because DHCP is good or something like that.
Why don't we just, that's what like readiness checks and things are for, I would imagine, right? I don't know.
Well, no, this is different. And this actually is helpful in terms of diagnosing where the networking broke down. Why isn't it reachable?
To be honest, yeah. So I would say that diagnosis can be done with other means as well. I still see value here. You know, if somebody needs to do the map, again, one of the values really is to have some correlation between the external and internal interfaces. We could actually say we scrape or don't expose the internal IP addresses at all, because we've got LUTX PR, right, which is doing the device role tagging, which might then expose enough information to see the internal and the external stuff. But today it doesn't work right? Because it's relying on the status, right? And if the status doesn't report the internal IP address,
No, it doesn't rely on the status, but it reports it within the guest.
Yeah, that might be, I mean, the question to me is what is the use case of the internal IP addresses in the external world? I struggle to see that use case.
Same here.
With the Masquerade, we can do the health check. Like, we don't need guest agent to do health check. We are the ones running the DHCP server inside the Virt launcher. So as long as we got a request for it would work. Sorry, what I meant to say is that if we offered anyone the link local address, we are healthy, but that doesn't cover the case where the user uses the cloud init to assign the IP. Never mind. Forget about last minute.
So next question I have is, if we do this change where we have the IPs and internal IPs, is that a big enough change that we should be considering a new API version?
Not if it's backwards compatible, right? And even if we have maybe small semantical differences like ordering, I mean, we never had strong guarantees about it. As long as we don't remove a field, I don't see need to increase the API version. The real question to me is if we need to expose the internal IP address.
Well, I think that's a bigger discussion. The internal IP, I think that's a separate discussion almost, because I think we all agree that the external IP addresses, they make sense. I think that the fix is to show the external IP address. That was a bug to show the internal one, perhaps. And then a follow-up, like that's a secondary thing maybe we can talk about later on, is how to represent internal IP addresses and the mappings there. I'm not sure we're going to solve that right now.
Yeah. And
well,
I think
let's jump on to another topic though, unless you have one more thought.
Just one note for, I guess that Václav raised this question just to get unblocked on his second PR, right? So Václav, would it be possible for you to continue with the second one without getting affected by this bug? Or
Not sure, because we have a race condition where once guest agent kicks in, both of like the word handler and word controller both tries to update the status. So if we can find a workaround to there, then it might be possible.
Maybe
Okay.
we just don't have the agent updating the IP address.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to propose. The next topic on the list here is to talk about the guest agent sub resource, which we're going to be adding.
Let's say a little bit. I know we have a little bit of spend a little bit of time on that, but it doesn't make sense to board it now. I think we still need something in order to unlock Vatsal, because then you can't continue. So let's stay on it, and whatever we don't get today, we just move it to next week. We have an agenda already prepared, so that's awesome. I never saw us so well prepared for the upcoming week. Yeah, what can we conclude? I mean, what are the next steps? Vatsal, what do you need to be on block in that PR? Because I know you've been working on that for so long.
Yeah, so as I said, the both PRs are actually separate. The combining issue is that they just try to push the things to like update the same status. So I don't know what alternative can we do there. If we can, I think Peter suggested that we could bring the second PR, which is about updating the VM, the migrated VM's pod, the status with the pod IP. If we can bring it to the word handler somehow, then this might not happen. But there might be issue with that as well, because word handler, I'm not sure if word handler can see the pod details right away.
So maybe I'm a bit uneducated, so sorry for asking, but what are the two issues we try to address correctly? I mean, one was what the ambiguity about the IP addresses, but what they seem to be erased, right?
Yeah, so the both issue, I will describe the second issue, which actually brought in this bug. The second issue was that once the VMs have migrated, the VMI status is not updated with the latest IP. So we tried to put a check in the word controller, where if the pod IP is not equal to the current the IP on the VMI is not equal to the pod IP, we tried to change it. We tried to update it, and that was fine until unless we found out that the guest agent, when the guest agent kicks in, it also tries to update the status with the IP that it has. So now both are trying to update the status. That was the corner case which is blocking the first PR.
So we need to move the authority to change the IP addresses to a central place, right? And that authority has multiple sources. Yeah. That would be my assumption. And that needs to make the call, which is the most reliable source, which do we take? And in my understanding, we can still all do all of that from the launcher, right? I don't see any need to stuff to handle.
I would contend that the guest agent should not be updating the IP address. It should be updating its own field, kind of the whole guest agent sub resource. The question was just asked a minute ago, why do we need the internal IP addresses at all? We don't. They're in the guest agent sub resource. Likewise, the guest agent should not be updating the canonical authoritative pod IP. It should be updating a separate field, basically indicating what its opinion of the IP is.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
I would argue that for the list of the requested networks, we don't have any other way to report their IP addresses but to use guest agent. And I find it valuable to see, okay, I requested these 5 networks, and I can take a look at these 5 networks and see right away which IP addresses they have and that are extra available without crawling to the. I would need, if I add IP addresses separately in the guest agent portion of the status, I would need to see, okay, this network was assigned this interface name, and then I need to go to guest agent and look for the interface name and collect the IPs.
Yeah, you just don't need to report. I mean, you just don't need to attach the pod network. That's it.
But what?
I think the problem is that actually, if we look at it from the non-pod network view, I think Pedro has a point, and that is whenever we attach layer 2 networks to a VM, then the guest agent is the only way to know about the IP address, right? So there's a reason for actually reporting the IP addresses of layer 2 interfaces of the guest agent on the API, because that's the only way to get those IP addresses. Because in the layer 2 case, so the system does not know those IP addresses ahead of time. That means in the current proposal, right, without taking that into account, we would always leave the IP addresses for layer 2 interfaces empty, which is very inconvenient, because then you need to do the jump, right? Then you need to go to the guest agent and look it up there. So I see Patrick's point. Yeah. It's not helpful for a user. And now I get your point why you were insisting. You're always insisting, right now. Why you were insisting on the masquerade point? Because if we know that NAT is in the game, the other way around. If we know that NAT is not used, that is an indication that the internal IP address is equal to the external IP address, and that is a helpful information to then say, because no NAT is used, this is the external IP address. I think, yeah.
And since it's part of the it's structure that's per network, right? It's not that we have this list of interfaces and IP addresses and the guest agent portion, and we on our own decide that this interface will have the public IP and this one will not. It's for this network, which we know has this binding, we report this or that. So it's almost, it's not really explicit, but it's close to it.
I think in general we need to do a table of possible network configuration, whether it's bridge mode or masquerade mode per interface type, and whether we can use multiple interfaces of this type in NAT or bridge modes. In general, this is some kind of information which, at least for me, will be useful in KubeVirt.
Yeah, I think the goal it has not changed. We as we want to provide the IP addresses the user can use to connect to the VM. And if the problems are different, if it's a masqueraded NIC or if it's a non-masqueraded NIC. Yeah. And especially in the layer 2 interface case, it's problematic because the system has no way to identify the external IP address because it's only visible to the guest. Unless we do spoofing. Not really. But Vladik, does it make sense? I mean, because we have that whole, do you agree? No,
Yeah,
because
there's no way to know the external, the layer 2 networks without a guest agent or anything else.
But do we also agree that it would be valuable to have them in the status IPs section, in the interfaces section, even if they are only visible to the guest?
I don't know. I mean, it depends on what we want. I mean, if we want to report whatever the guest is seeing, yeah, that's valuable. If it's not, then I don't know, the end user may not connect to those networks, may not be able to connect to those networks. Then I don't know, why do we have to bother? I mean, we only need to care about those networks that we actually can connect to. So I don't know how to correlate.
So when it comes to debugging, more information is always better than less information.
Yeah, so if you want all the information about what's actually inside the VM, you can look at the huge log of all the guest agent reports, right? That's all you need. You have all the interfaces, all their IP addresses. You can do all the debugging you need. But the interfaces list with their IP addresses is more well-groomed and structured, beautiful API that tells you, okay, this VM is connected to these networks, and if you are a different VM connected to the same network, you can reach out to this one over this IP address.
Yeah, I just think that this whole thing can be reported as a sub-resource or something. It doesn't have to be in the status.
I tell you, yeah, why I'm challenging it is because layer 2 networks are so common, right, in the network world, regardless if it's SRIV or we do, I don't know, OVS stuff, and we provide layer 2 network. It's so common, right? In other words, I think the pod network is the only network which will have masquerade by default, right? So all other networks will always be bridged, and that means if we don't put it into the status API, right, in the status interface API, then it's very cumbersome to get the IP addresses for this pretty normal task, right? So for the regular case, we make it hard to identify the IP addresses. That is my worry, right?
And also the IP address, since we are reporting is something from the side, it can change, right? And if you are implementing a controller that creates some magical services for VMs based on their L2 networks, you need to subscribe to it. And I don't think you can subscribe to sub-resource, can you? So that would merit to, like, it would merit if we had it inside the main status field.
Yeah, then we can still do it. It just, I mean, what I'm bothered with is the pod network. I mean, it kind of should be separated. And
Yeah, maybe we can do it. So, because I think I would say it's so important, right? Because layer 2 networks are so important. What my takeaway would be, I would still see, regardless where the information is coming from, we should expose the information in status interfaces. And we should expose the IP addresses there, which external users can use, right? So the pod network, in the pod network, it's the pod IP, or any masqueraded NIC, it's like the external IP. And for layer 2 networks, and we know about layer 2 networks because we know, based on the binding, we know what kind of binding, we know what kind of binding it is, and we could use the guest agent information to expose the external IP addresses as well. If the guest agent is not there, then the information would be empty.
That's what Václav's PR fixes. Like, I think that with the first one, this is the state.
so then we were basically building some kind of a foundation for end users to use these IPs and rely on it as a, I don't know, as a resource that should be always there, but it may not be there. I mean, the agent is not something reliable.
So let me rephrase. You're saying the drawback is that it's actually not always, the information is not always available. And that is an issue for such.
Yes, we are building some kind of a building block of KubeVirt that provides information. This information may not be there. It's kind of not reliable. I don't know.
I wonder how we can make it easy. So I do agree on that aspect as well. Right. So if we say, what we do know, Peter, for bridge bindings, do we know the MAC address? You're muted.
It's so hard to hit the mute button on Zoom. We know the MAC address. I think so. We assign it, and whatever MAC address we assign is inside the VM.
Yeah, I mean for binding it should really be the same, right, internally and externally, I guess.
And I think we even use the MAC address to find the interface for the network. So.
Because if I think of something like a UI, right, a UI would probably want to show for all the interfaces IP addresses, right? I think with what maybe an option would be, because I see Vladik's point, right? So maybe it's difficult. What I could see is, right, that we then at least make it easy to find for a given interface, to find the IP addresses that are reported by the guest agent, right? So what you said, right, the guest agent side. So that we say we need at least to ensure that somehow we have a reference from the interface to the discovered guest agent information, maybe by network name or maybe by MAC address, but that you can easily come up with a jQuery path, right, to jQuery expression in order to look up the IP address. And that should be fairly easy if the MAC address, for example, is unique. It could also be done with the network name. If we can do it.
Yeah, I get your point.
Because then we could, sorry for interrupting, but then the benefit would be that the status interfaces is really reliable and it is not based on optional components, right? It's only, it's validatable information by the system, not relying on optional components inside the guest, which is an important thing, right? but we still enable the use case to quickly find the IP address by then referencing the optional information which are in the guest agent on the guest agent side.
Okay, but that's all right. So for L2, we can reference to the guest agent portion. That's fine. For backwards compatibility, we still have the list, but the other issue is that how to say it? It's we still need to keep the IP address that was given for the masquerade bot IP inside the interface, and then for like additional ones, we just link to the guest agent report. It's just like we still need IP and IP's like list, but on top of that, we expose additional information through the guest agent, which is fine. It's just like adding fields and not dropping any.
You want not to report the internal IP for masquerade in that case?
No, just like there are other ways to report IP address that should be assigned to the VM. One of the ways, like we have masquerade, that's one thing. But if a user uses IPAM section in CNI, so let's say they use L2, they use bridges, but well, they don't use L2 because they have IPAM section in their network attachment definition, which says this network attachment definition is giving IP from this range, for instance. Then we can report this IP in the list of IPs. And I'm just confusing myself more and more because it's like so many things to report and like, I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah. I think we're making good progress. So David had to drop out. Maybe it's a good point to summarize the discussion as he recommended on the mailing list and to pick it up again next week to then have a funding agreement. And then we have like 4 minutes for anything urgent somebody wants to raise or discuss in the remaining time. To me, it was important to do it because after all, it's, many people are affected by this. So that's why I wanted to spend some time on this. Sorry to anybody else. Okay. Peter, would you be fine if we defer the topic to next week with the guest agent? It might actually be contributing to the discussion on the mailing list if we pick up the IP discussion there.
You need to be more specific about Peter.
Oh yeah, Peter. The puppy Peter. Yes, still muted.
Yeah, it was me. And Peter, you're right. The mute button is really weird. I'm okay with that. I've written my notes, and there is not much to tell. That we just introduced a new subresource, and it's available for hackers to use it. That's it.
Maybe Hassan will be the first to use it. Okay. Daniel, I would say we do not move your topic out because there's also something to discuss and might also be interesting to others. And then I see Vishesh to make it simple and useful that this discussion to you as well. Do you want to raise your topic about the DMI preset?
Should I raise it right now or we are out of time?
We have 2 minutes left.
Okay,
Maybe.
so I'll be quick. So what I want to do is I want to assign service account to a bunch of VMs, but I don't want the end user to know about it. Basically, I want to change the service account I'm using on the fly without the end user knowing that there is a service account that is being added and what the service account is. So a natural solution that came to me is using VMI presets. But since VMI preset do not support disk or the object doesn't even have volumes on it, I was wondering what's the reason for that, and can I do that, or what's the reason behind it? It's what I want to know.
So I'm probably the best one to answer this. From my dim recollection from ancient history, I had originally in the PR for the presets initially added the volumes and disks. I believe that there was a concern with it being mutable. Basically, it wouldn't necessarily mean the same thing, which is obviously your use case. You want it to be able to change. And so I think we had simply said at the time that we were concerned that it could introduce instability, but I personally am not opposed to it. we could re-implement that feature.
Yeah.
Okay.
I want to say, yeah, I think we left it out for security, or I mean, not security in the sense of security, but data corruption reasons. We were careful with that. But yeah, maybe if we revive that topic, I think nobody's opposing to that. As you said, we had it initially in, and we only kept it up for data corruption reasons. Because after all, what also allow you to add volumes to them, I mean, they will just be appended to the list. I'm not seeing why we shouldn't be able to do it, right? To append a volume or disks like service accounts to it.
Okay, okay. Only I think the only concern, I think David mentioned it, that how will you if multiple presets are there, there's a VM and there's this list of disk and volumes, how do you exactly merge and how do you identify the conflict, right? I think with data corruption, you mean this, right?
It's simpler than it used to be. I had actually managed to merge them quite straightforward, because we used to have a name field, but now the name field must actually match. So the concern would be if you add a volume, you should probably add a disk at the same time, because nothing else would necessarily be guaranteed to add it. But that would be, I don't know if we want to enforce that, or if we just want to make that something that is just best practice, or if we want to say you can't do it if you don't have both.
Actually, I'll give a thought to it. I have not given a thought to it at all. I have just saw that it's not there and I wanted to know the reason why it's not there. So I think if you guys are, I think everybody's open to having it. So I'll give it a thought and see what all challenges are there and maybe come up with a PR of some sort. So we can discuss.
Sounds good.
Okay. I actually have one more quick, maybe we're running out of time. I'll talk about this the next meeting. I don't want to stretch it forever.
Okay, whatever you prefer. The agenda is open. Okay. Alrighty, people. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night. Sleep well and good morning. Thanks, it was a vivid discussion. You know, solving some of these long-standing issues is really, we need to donate some time to it, like, you know, all the network stuff and finalizing that ultimately. We need to invest into it to shape the API up. We want to stabilize, right? We want a V1 at some point, and that's part of it. So, great. Okay, I'm done.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.